Welcome back. Gender-based violence is once again in the spotlight. A third-year TUT student in Kaba died after she was allegedly assaulted by her ex-boyfriend. Responding to the brutal murder, Higher Health says there are parallels between GBV and the HIV epidemic. It says the two have coexisted in our society for many years and has now become part of our social fabric. It also says both are underpinned by gender bias. So let's discuss this now with Higher Health CEO, Professor Ramneek Ahluwalia, joining me this morning. Prof, always a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for making time for the South African morning. I mean, I wish it was for a different conversation. We have to once again put the spotlight on the safety of students in institutions of higher learning. I think before I get into the statement that you have released and the parallels you have drawn between HIV pandemic and GBV, let's talk about that exactly, the safety of students. Surely this is concerning, where it's only February and there's a murder. A 20-year-old has been brutally murdered.
Thank you, Tumelo. I think it's a sad moment when we discuss such moments, losing any young life, a young life where there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of future, there's parents' hope. Everybody's hope gets shattered in just blink of this menace, what we call as a gender-based violence. And it's one of our biggest killer in the post-school system, probably in the society in general. And I think it's a national crisis, and we all have to embrace this is a reality. And that's why when I spoke about thinking around, and we as a nation, as a country, we grappled 3 decades of a very brutal fight against HIV, which is very societal and bogs down to the same epidemic drivers, and how we had to build systems in our communities, how we had to put early interventions to put prevention, safety. I think gender-based violence now warrants a multifaceted, multi-sectoral. No alone higher education can win this without a very strong multi-sectoral response. It's it's not a linear pandemic. It's multifaceted. It spreads across deep into our communities and societies. Is the thinking that needs to be warranted to change. And I think when you go into community thinking change perspective, a huge amount of transformation is needed. And I think that's why this is a very complex pandemic, and it's a crisis. We cannot lose young people. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, and we send our condolences to Kaba's family, her loved ones, her friends. No parent, no family prepares for such a tragedy. Doc, I think interestingly as well, you mentioned that there are parallels between gender-based violence and the HIV pandemic. Take us through this and why it has existed for many years, just in case, you know, we hadn't noticed the two walking alongside each other for these past years and decades.
Definitely. So for me, there are practical lessons that we need to learn from the HIV pandemic and apply to the gender-based violence pandemic. There are 2 coexistent pandemics. The third one is mental health eventually, because that is brewing along with these pandemics silently and quietly, and actually is one of the drivers that also affects the life of young lives. But what we have seen in HIV pandemic was it's a societal pandemic. It was a health pandemic, but very societal, which means it needed us to go to the grassroots, go to the bottom. There was, as much as you needed a leadership buy-in on the top, but what you needed was community education, community empowerment. It's thanks to you, Tumelo, for raising this issue on national news. We needed broadcasters, we needed media, we needed a strong community empowerment program. What we needed was people understand how it spreads, why it is down in the community. It was linked to patriarchy. It is still linked to young women being the biggest, somebody facing the highest HIV. And of course, there are those reasons of drugs and alcohol, the reasons of patriarchy, the toxic masculinity. These surrounded us. And we had to tackle all of them by empowering a young woman. Here we need to empower a young man and a woman jointly, as we had to do it in HIV. So I think there are reasons. Civic education will play a very central role. We started on that journey on civic education. We built a huge army of peer educators in our communities, in order to start engaging peer-to-peer. No better than a young person empowering another young person. And that has to start the movement again. So those same structures that were built for HIV have to be needed now, are being trained and should be trained in full women empowerment, full men empowerment, full GBVF empowerment. Gender studies are critical co-curriculums of the post-school education. If this pandemic is at such a high level in our system, then it has to be tackled through a very strong community empowerment system. Education will play a role. And the motto has to be early intervention saves life. If you look at the pattern, Nosikelo, Dukozo, if you look at all of them, it's a relationship that goes sour, it's long-standing relationships, and eventually leads to jealousy, eventually to a murder, eventually, and life gets lost. What happens if we can crack this pandemic early? Exactly how we wanted with HIV. Early detection, early risk interventions, early empowerment, and can we bring family support? Can we bring couple therapy? Can we detach away from each other? Can we empower Ntukozo in the future? And many more who are still there. So I think that's the movement we have to move into.
Right. Well, Prof, I wish we can get more into this discussion, quite a thought-provoking one, but you're absolutely right. I think also breaking the silence and bringing these issues to the open, as you've mentioned, can be one of the ways with which we can get to some sort of resolution and end this GBV as well as the HIV epidemic. But I appreciate you, of course, coming to the fore and adding your voice to this. Higher Health CEO, Professor Ramneek Ahluwalia, thank you so much for your time.